love that I'm getting my rockin' music behind me. But we're going to go ahead and I just want to share a little bit as to the meaning behind this. It has regrettably been an accusation made against many and against Christianity that oftentimes it's anti-intellectual or something to that effect. And we believe that, we believe that from a biblical worldview, that we are supposed to actually utilize the very brains that God gave because they're a gift. And that being said, we want to help us think through matters at a more sincere and thoughtful level. And so this is an opportunity for us to consider one of those big questions. And so we want to allow this to be something of a genuine dialogue because you can't understand me? Can you understand now, Margaret? Nope. Okay. Anyways, so what I was going to say is that when it comes to this evening, we want to allow you to genuinely ask questions. For many who don't know, I'm the pastor here, but there was a serious time in my life where I went through all sorts of questions. Does God exist? And I went through a major period of what went into some depression just because of these types of questions and really wrestling at a very sincere level of, and it became something of a crisis in my life. And so I want to encourage us to actually ask these questions. And so Dr. Barnes is not going to be fearful of any questions you may have. And so we want to allow you tonight to ask your questions in one of two ways. We understand that it's not always the most comfortable to throw yourself out there and actually ask in a more dialogical approach in front of people. But we do know it's much easier to go ahead and just write questions down, and we will. So we want to make sure everyone has a 3x5 card tonight. So raise your hand if you do not have a 3x5 card, and Patty will go ahead and get you one of those. And we want to just keep them up as she's passing those out. So this is an opportunity for you to write down questions as you're hearing tonight's little lecture, which will be around 30-40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to a Q&A time. And so this is just an opportunity. The second way, though, is if you actually would like to ask a question following the presentation and do so with a microphone, that would be wonderful. But we just want to allow you to know that there's two opportunities in asking those questions. For those who do not know, we do have restrooms, and they would be, as you exit out this door, you just go out to the left and then hook a left, and they are on your right side in that hallway there. So that being said, I want to turn it over to Will now, who's going to share some introductory remarks about Dr. Barnes.
Great. Well, thank you guys for coming. Just as a brief introduction for Dr. Barnes, he has had a unique path to his academic career as he spent several years as a business executive prior to earning several degrees in theology and philosophy. And in ministry, he served as a bivocational pastor. He's also served as a chaplain at Oxford for nearly a decade, sometime around then, where he now serves as the professor of workplace in theology and business ethics at Gordon Conwell. So he's my professor and has been my mentor for the past year. And so he's going to, again, present on morality as an argument for God's existence. So without further ado, please give Dr. Barnes a round of applause.
Good evening. So it is true, I had a circuitous route to my life as an academic, but it was a really interesting route because my work took me all over the world, and I was able to engage with people in cultures very, very different than mine. And so that helped me hone my apologetic skills. This might be a touch too loud. If we could just turn this down a little bit. Thank you. And eventually I left the corporate world and began teaching and serving as a chaplain at Oxford University and now at Gordon Conwell. And imagine what a joy it is to have people like Will as your student. It's absolutely a joy. So Will was in my apologetics class, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. In fact, if we could go right to the next slide, I want to unpack what we mean by apologetics. So there are several ways to define apologetics. And apologetics is an interesting word, by the way, because it comes from the Greek apologia, which means to give an account, to explain yourself. Now, over time, when someone said, "You owe me an explanation," it often led to someone admitting that they did something wrong, and therefore they had an act of contrition, "I'm sorry," to the point where the actual use of the word changed. So now when someone says, "Make an apology," you expect them to say, "I'm sorry." But the actual root of the word is not "say you're sorry." The root of the word is "explain yourself." And so this first definition from the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Faith, I don't really like very much. It says it's the defense of the Christian faith on intellectual grounds by trained theologians and philosophers. Yeah, sometimes. But anybody, in fact, everybody, according to Scripture, according to 1 Peter, everybody who proclaims Jesus as Lord is expected to explain not only what they believe, but why they believe it. And so Professor Alistair McGrath, who has written many books on apologetics, he says that in a basic sense, it's an apology for the Christian faith, a presentation and defense of its claims to truth and relevance, and this is important, in the great marketplace of ideas. I love that term. The great marketplace of ideas. We are all swimming in that same water. Whether you're a believer or a non-believer, a Christian, a Jew, an atheist, a Muslim, a secular humanist, whatever you might be, an agnostic, you are swimming constantly in that marketplace of ideas. So, when we talk about Christian apologetics, if I go to the next slide, please, we have to talk about two clarifying things. One is rhetoric, and the other is logic. Because whenever you give an account of something, whenever you try to explain to someone why you believe what you believe, it doesn't really help very much if you just say, "God said it, I believe it, that settles it." You know, that's just kind of like not really helpful. And there used to be a bumper sticker that actually said that. Okay, sorry. In apologetic terms, we don't use that method very often anymore. So people expect you to make a cogent case for why you believe what you believe. So the thing about rhetoric is it is, in the strictest term, it's the art of persuasion. Rhetoric is nothing more than figuring out how to get someone to understand where you are. Now, rhetoric gets a bad rap, right? Because we often think of it negatively, as someone trying to manipulate the way you think. But actually, Aristotle, over 2,000 years ago, he kind of codified what rhetoric is and why this thing called rhetoric, this art of persuasion, is actually very good for society. First of all, he explains that it's ethically neutral. In other words, a person could be an effective rhetorician whether they're arguing for something that's true or false. Right? So in that sense, it's ethically neutral. But he talks about three modes of rhetoric. And these three modes of rhetoric are very important because to Aristotle, the nature and the character of the person who's making the argument is just as important as what they're saying. So he talks about the ethos, the ethics, the integrity of the person making the argument, and then the pathos, the empathy that someone has with the person to whom they are speaking. So we never, ever, ever treat someone that we're trying to explain our faith to as a project, right? They are not a project of ours. They're a person with genuine concerns and genuine questions. And we have got to love them first and foremost. And that's part of the pathos. And then lastly, it's the logos. The logos is that if you consider any argument, there are always what you would call inartistic proofs. In other words, these are brute facts. No one can argue with the brute facts. But mostly what we differ over are these inarticulate proofs. Those things that we can have a disagreement on, and that's okay for us to have these disagreements. So when it comes to an apologetic about the existence of God, let me just start by saying the best apologetic for the existence of God is love. That's the best apologetic for the existence of God. For two reasons. One, because God is love, which we'll talk about a few times tonight. And secondly, because that will purify your motive at all times. You should never try to win the argument when it comes to apologetics. You want to win the person. So apologetics is actually done best in relationship. In relationship. It's not transactional, it's relational. And one of the problems is we live in a culture which has just elevated the transactional. It's all about winning and losing. I win, you lose. That's not what apologetics is about at all. It's about finding a win-win. It's finding a way for us to have mutual respect for each other and to allow our beliefs to take their place in that marketplace of ideas. Because frankly, I think when properly understood and executed, there is no equal to the Christian claims to truth in the marketplace of ideas. Could I have the next slide, please? So, that's rhetoric. Now I want to talk about logic. And this is really important. Logic is nothing more than the study of correct reasoning. And there are basically three types of logic. And it's important to understand that all three of them are perfectly legitimate. And the topic, the nature of the topic will often determine which is the appropriate form of logic to apply. So the first one, the one that we just default to, why? Because it's associated with the scientific method, is deductive reasoning. So that's a conclusion that's based on logically correct premises, so-called syllogisms. An example, all humans are mammals. John is human. Therefore, he must be a mammal. There's no other way around it, because we've just established that all humans are mammals. So another way of looking at an argument, however, is not through deductive, but inductive. And that is, you come to a conclusion based on the reasonable probability and logically correct premises. So I got news for you. Those of you who are not in the medical profession, here's a dirty little secret about medicine. It's a very inexact science. Okay? It is. And when you go to the doctor, very rarely does the doctor say, I have this evidence, therefore it's definitely this. Sometimes. Rarely, though. Let's be honest. They make an inductive, reasoned, logical conclusion that, well, you know, the probability is, based on what I've seen, based on what you've told me, based on past observations, based on experience, the best, most reasonable probability is this. And that is perfectly legitimate. So, if I were to say that all observable swans are white, and the bird in question is a swan, then the probability, though not the necessity, is that the bird is white. Because it's possible in some world where you have a black swan. So it's not a deductive argument, it's an inductive argument. And then the last is also just as legitimate, and that is abductive reasoning. And that is an inference to the best explanation. Right? It's the best explanation I've got. Now, it doesn't mean you haven't thought about it. It doesn't mean you didn't make observations. It doesn't mean that you didn't collect data. It doesn't mean that you didn't compare the data. In fact, most of what happens in the world, for instance, of astrophysics is abductive reasoning. Most of what happens in the world of astrophysics is abductive reasoning. And I know this because a lot of the students that I worked with in Oxford happen to be astrophysicists. And I would ask them to explain their research and their experimentation. What do you do? And they would basically say, well, look, we're not sure, but it's the best explanation we have. And that's okay. I'll give the next slide, please. So, let's talk about the 4 traditional arguments. I don't like the term arguments. Why? Because it kind of gives the implication of an adversarial, but that's the term that's used. So, the 4 traditional arguments for the existence of God are these. First is the teleological argument, from the word telos, meaning necessity. So, the teleological argument is the argument based on both necessity and design. So, wherever you see a design, you presume a designer. So, William Paley's, watchmaker analogy, etc. All of those arguments, they're good arguments. They're really, really good arguments. But they're not unassailable. No argument for the existence of God is unassailable. Why? Because if it were, we wouldn't call it faith. Right? And God would not be mysterious. And part of God's nature and being is the mystery of God. He chooses to remain a little bit unknowable. We know enough, but we don't know everything. And that's important to remember, because that's part of his sovereignty. So the teleological argument is a really good argument, but it's not without its flaws or with its weaknesses. And the interesting thing is, if you read Richard Dawkins' book, right, about the existence of God, the God delusion, he spends almost the entire book on the teleological argument, which is kind of silly. You know why? Because the way he determines that there's a weakness in the teleological argument is he wants to apply the rules of the material sciences to an entity, to a being that is by definition metaphysical. Think about that conflict. You can't do that. Right? The rules of the physical world do not apply to that which is metaphysical. Another really good argument, one that I often use, is the cosmological argument. This is the argument from causation and from motion and from contingency. In other words, things exist and they don't have to. And everything we can observe that exists had a beginning. So the first cause that is uncontingent on any other cause is God. It's called the cosmological argument. It's a very good argument. But again, it's not unassailable. The ontological argument is the hardest one for most people because it's a purely philosophical argument. And it's the argument from being. And basically, it's specifically the argument from the belief that God is a maximally great being. And because God is a maximally great being, if you could even conceive of something greater than God, that would be God. So since you can't conceive of anything greater than that which is a maximally great being, the maximally great being must exist. So you have St. Anselm to blame for that one. And then we get to tonight's main feature, the moral argument. Basically, the moral argument is the argument from the concept of objective morality. Objective morality. But let me just say something right now. It's actually from something much more profound than even morality. Because when we think of morality, what do we normally think of? We think of behavior. Actually, the argument from goodness, righteousness, and justice. That's what it is. It's an argument from goodness, righteousness, and justice. We could have the next screen, please. We need to do the film. Just a 5-minute video from William Lane Craig, and we're going to watch that. And they're pulling it over. We teed it up, so I know it's there. You have to drag it still. There it is. There it comes. And if you could make it big. Oh, you had it. That's it. In the lower right-hand corner there is that big box. There it is. Oh, if you can go back to the beginning. Okay, just 5 minutes, then we'll talk. I don't know how he got Billie Holiday in there, but that was good too. So, let's unpack this a little bit, if I may. Here's the way William Lane Craig creates a deductive argument out of that. He starts by saying, if God does not exist, objective morality cannot exist. Objective morality exists, therefore, God must exist. And sounds like an airtight argument. The only problem is, the initial premise is not unassailable. Because there are people who will argue, well, wait a minute. The fact that God may or may not exist doesn't preclude the fact that objective morality exists. You just can't point to a source. So this is the problem when you try to make a deductive argument, when actually an inductive argument is perfectly fine here. Okay? So the way I would word it is, some objective morality or moral standards exist. A perfect moral being, aka a God, is the most logical source of objective morality. Therefore, the existence of God is the best explanation for the existence of any objective morality. Now, you see the difference in those two arguments? If you prefer the deductive one, have a ball, but understand it's not unassailable. I think it's always better for us to present arguments that admit the fact that none of these arguments are unassailable. Because it forces the person we're speaking to think deeply about whether or not the abductive conclusion or inductive conclusion is a reasonable one, is a logical one. So Kant also had an interesting perspective on this. Kant said that moral behavior is rational, but only in the pursuit of justice. God is the ultimate arbiter of justice. Remember that term when we have question and answers later. God is the ultimate arbiter of justice. Therefore, moral behavior is rational and God must exist. Very, very interesting way of putting it. However, it presumes the existence of God. Now, there are some evolutionary biologists who will cite the utility of morality, right? They will basically say, well, wait a minute. There is group benefit in us not killing each other. And they are absolutely right. However, and I've had a lot of conversations with moral philosophers in Oxford about this, they cannot come up with group benefit for altruism. It's impossible to come up. In fact, by definition, it wouldn't be altruism if there was any discernible group of benefit. There's a far, far better thing I do than I have ever done before, right? Tale of Two Cities. That is an act of altruism. He's not going to get the girl, and him giving his life had absolutely no group benefit. Benefit only to the woman he loved. So that's important to keep in mind. Can I have the next slide, please? Morality, I believe, is a rational enterprise in all considerations, not just in the pursuit of justice. This is where I would slightly disagree with Kant on this. Because, in fact, there are other reasons why morality might be a rational enterprise. And we'll unpack some of that in a minute. For instance, we know that moral facts and duties exist, whether they're subjective or objective, right? He gave examples of both, subjective and objective. Well, because we know that those standards exist, then the question reasonably becomes, what's the source? Well, I think human depravity and moral turpitude make humanity a pretty unlikely source of morality. Right? I mean, observe human nature. I think we are a pretty unlikely source. So, QED, moral facts and duties are logically grounded in a necessary, rational, and non-contingent source, which we call God. Which William Lane Craig was absolutely right in that final conclusion about the fact that it all points to God. But you don't have to have a deductive argument to have it point to God. It points to God no matter what. No matter how you frame it, it points to God. Because God is not merely the source of goodness, God is good. Which brings us to the next slide. So, the Euphra dilemma. This goes back to Plato. In one of Plato's dialogues, he's having this conversation, and it was later modernized by a German philosopher in the 18th century, Gottfried Leibniz. And this was the supposed argument against the moral argument. Does God merely acknowledge what is good and right and just, or does God determine what is good, right, and just? Now, the dilemma rests actually in confusion between God's agency, i.e., that which God does, and God's sovereignty, who God is. So there is no dilemma because God's sovereignty must be indisputable or else it's not God. So God's sovereignty is indisputable. And God's agency, the things he does, including declaring certain things good, reflects all the other aspects of God's being, nature, and character. So here's where I'm going to give you my 2 cents. You're not going to read this in any other books. The being, the nature, and the character of God. What do I mean by that? The being rests in 2 aspects of God's existence. One is the Trinity. That God lives uniquely in communion with itself, himself. And the second is God's sovereignty, his indisputable sovereignty. The nature of God, given to us in the Gospel of John, God is love. That's God's nature. Not merely to love, but he is love. Ontologically. And the last is character. And this is the one that trips everybody up. Where do we find the character of God? Well, I would say to you that we find the character of God. It is revealed to us in the tension between God's holiness and his grace. That's where God reveals his character. The Kadesh in Hebrew, his holiness, and in his grace. That's where that tension exists. So, the relationship between the being, the nature, and the character of God and morality are summed up best, in my opinion, in the Decalogue, in the 10 Commandments. Let's talk a little bit about the 10 Commandments. I've got news for you. I don't think the 10 Commandments get enough press anymore. When I was a kid, you learned and you memorized the 10 Commandments. I don't know why they don't anymore. But look at them now through the prism of what I just described to you about the being, the nature, and the character of God. The very first commandment, I am Yahweh, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods before me. It is established beyond question, God is sovereign. And the very next one, thou shalt not make any graven images, you are all susceptible to idols that compete with God. Which is why God has to exercise his character in that tension between his holiness and his grace, because we chase after other idols. And thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. That's establishing the holiness of God. And when it says, remember the Sabbath, who taught us the most important thing to know about the Sabbath? I just wrote a book on this. Jesus. Mark 2:27, when he's breaking the rules, which is how we think of morality, right? He's breaking the rules by taking the grain of wheat and eating on the Sabbath. And what does Jesus say? The Sabbath was made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. All of God's morality and all of God's goodness and all of God's justice are for our benefit. And why this next one? Did this one ever kind of throw you a little bit? Why honor thy father and mother? Because our parents are deputy suzerains to God when it comes to teaching us about who he is and what he expects. That's not an accident that it says honor your father and mother. It's there very specifically for a reason. It is as much a charge to the parents as it is a warning to the children. You are my deputy suzerain. You must teach them who I am, and you must teach them what I expect, which is the next 5 commandments. 1, thou shalt not kill. Pretty basic stuff. Pretty basic stuff. We would know this even if there weren't 10 commandments. We would know this intrinsically because the nature of God, the image of God, still rests with all of us. The Imago Dei, as we call it. But God spells it out very clearly. And this is the first and most important, because if you don't accept that it's wrong to kill, none of the other commandments will mean anything. And what's the next one? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Why? Why is that on the list? There's the old joke, Moses came down from the mountain and said, I got good news and bad news. Good news is I got them down to 10. Bad news is adultery is still on the list. But it's because adultery is covenant breaking. And God administers his kingdom through covenants. Remember that as well for later. God administers his kingdom through covenants. And it's the basis for the nuclear family, which is the agency of teaching us who God is and what's expected. So right after do not kill comes do not commit adultery. Do not defile what God has made holy. Do not steal. The right to private property. Do not steal. Why? Because stealing is what happens when you break the last of the commandments. And that is do not covet what your neighbor has. Because if you covet and there's no prohibition against stealing, you will take what's not yours. And then number 9, in the middle there, do not bear false witness against your neighbor. Why is that important? Well, I'll tell you why. No sociologist worth their salt, secular or religious, will tell you anything other than it is impossible for any civilization to flourish if there isn't a presumption of truth-telling. You cannot have courts of law. You cannot have commerce. You cannot have any of the things we take for granted without the presumption of telling the truth. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to live in a world where those things weren't important. And I certainly wouldn't want to live in a world where someone like Richard Dawkins comes along, and I know Richard Dawkins, I've had dinner with Richard Dawkins, I can tell you stories, who says, actually, there is no morality. It's all just brute, pitiless chance. And we don't kill each other because of the evolutionary benefit. I think even the most hardened atheists, if they're honest with themselves, would prefer to live in a world where those are the rules than no rules. I have the next slide, please. So I put these next two slides here because Adam Smith is one of my heroes. I wrote a book a few years ago called Redeeming Capitalism. And everybody knows, or most people are familiar with, his famous book, The Wealth of Nations. But he wrote a book before he wrote Wealth of Nations called Moral Sentiments. And in this, he gives you the positive aspect of morality. Because morality isn't just about what you don't do, it's what you can do. And it's not just about the punishment for doing what you shouldn't do, it's about the reward for doing what you should do. Here's what he says. No matter how selfish you think man is, it's obvious that there are some principles in his nature that give him an interest in the welfare of others and make their happiness necessary to him, even if he gets nothing from it but the pleasure of seeing it. That's also a definition of altruism. That's what is involved in pity or compassion, the emotion we feel for the misery of others when we see it or are made to think about it in a vivid way. The sorrow of others often makes us sad. That's an obvious matter of fact that doesn't need to be argued for by giving examples. The sentiment, like all the other basic passions of human nature, is not confined to virtuous and humane people. This is a universal thing, though they may feel it more intensely than others do. And then I love this language. The greatest ruffian, most hardened criminal has something of it. There's no one who's beyond redemption. There's no one whom we can't reach with the good news of a God who is good and righteous and just. One more quote from Adam Smith, please. The next one, please. Oh, here it is. You're ahead of me. The only actions of men that were truly praiseworthy or could claim any merit in God's sight are ones that flowed from benevolence. It is only by actions of charity and love that we can suitably imitate the conduct of God, expressing our humble and devout admiration of his infinite perfections. Only by fostering in our own minds the divine drive towards benevolence can we make our own affections resemble more closely God's holy attributes, thereby becoming more proper objects of his love and esteem, until at last we arrive at the state that this philosophy is trying to get us to, namely immediate converse and communication with God. If you want to be close to God, be like God, is what he's saying. So, what does morality teach us? Let's see if we've answered even partially the question of the evening. Well, moral behavior is reasonable, logical, and beneficial. I think we've established that point. We know from both instinct and experience that some things are good, right, and just. We also know from both experience and observation that humanity is an unlikely source of goodness, righteousness, and justice. Evolution may explain some moral behavior, but it cannot explain all moral behavior. Morality is both proscriptive, what we shouldn't do, and prescriptive, what we should do. Morality is both protective, keeps us safe, and therapeutic, gives us joy. Morality is strong evidence for the existence of a non-contingent, omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect being whom we call God. And morality reflects the being, the nature, and the character of God. Thank you.
Thank you. So at this time, what we want to do is give you about 2 minutes to write down any questions. And hopefully you've been writing down questions, but if you haven't yet, go ahead and start. Take some time to write down some questions. And what we'll do is in about 2 minutes, we will gather those questions, and then we'll have an opportunity to start working through some of those together.
I feel like we should have the Jeopardy music. Dun, dun, dun. have a rule, by the way. No one ever likes to ask the first question, so we're going to start with the second question. Are you going to pass the mic or something? Yeah, the easiest way. Got to be the second one now. So use the mic.
Well, I'm impressed. People are actually bold enough to actually ask questions out loud too. So let's go ahead and we'll begin with those, and I will again start passing it over to the sides, and we'll go ahead and do that. But as Matt starts off with a softball, as he says.
Thanks for tonight. That was great. In thinking about the argument for God and God in general, and the existence or the suspected existence of other gods around, is it applied similarly to other religions? Or do you make an argument for one specific God?
Okay, so that's a great question. So most of what we do in apologetics is an argument for theism, okay? And that's not the same thing as Christianity, but it's a step in the right direction. Obviously, we use our understanding of our God as the basis for our information, but you'd be amazed at how many similarities there are. So Will didn't have a chance to explain that my area of expertise, what I publish on primarily, is the intersection of faith, work, and economics. And I was asked to contribute a chapter to a reference book called I forget who the publisher was now, but it was the handbook on business ethics. And they asked me to write the chapter on religious belief and business ethics. And I had to cover all the major world religions. And in it, I come to the conclusion that there are some differences based primarily on our understanding of the deity and also anthropology, but there are more similarities between all the world religions and Christianity than you might otherwise expect. But that's because ethics and morality are not unique to Christianity. They are unique to all of humankind. Just, by the way, like Sabbath. Sabbath is not unique to the Jews and the Christians. Sabbath was given to all of humanity at the very beginning. Right? So there's so much that God gives us as human beings, which are universal, that point us toward Him. So I hope that answered your question, that in my experience, if you're dealing with someone who is genuinely agnostic or atheist, the first hurdle you have to get to is theism. And from there, it's very easy to start talking about our God. Now, I'll give you an interesting diversion from that concept. I was once asked to give a talk to a town hall. It was not a church. It was a town hall just outside of Oxford. And the people that were hosting it wanted the title of the talk to be, Does God Exist? And I said, I'm happy to come and talk, but that can't be the title. Because God exists. So the question I want you to put on the thing is God real? And when I got there that night, I explained to everybody, the reason why this is not called Does God Exist, because even if Richard Dawkins was sitting here with us, he would be the first one to admit that God exists in his mind as an idea. Specifically a mutant meme, if you want to read his book. I'll save you the trouble. So the question is not, does God exist? The question is, are any of our known constructs of God true? And when you put the question through that filter, I come up with Christianity pretty quickly. And that's what the whole lecture was about. How you get from, are any of our known constructs of God true? So you don't always have to make the theist stop on the train. but it's often very helpful. Great question. Next question.
Was there anything you wanted to add about that? Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah, great. Okay, so here's why. First of all, the Hebrew word for rest isn't Sabbath. The Hebrew word for rest is noach. Sabbath means stop. Stop. So, in the Hebrew tradition, if you look at the original creation narratives, there's actually a mini Sabbath after every single day of creation. God stops, and he assesses, and then he passes judgment. It's good. And then he goes to the next day. And it's at the end of those 6 days of creation that he takes a full stop. And it's from that last day of creation that the Hebrew tradition gets its Shabbat, which of course is encoded in Exodus, as a reflection of God's creative fiat. Now, Jesus turned the whole thing on his head. When Jesus said that Sabbath was made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath, it forces us, Christians, to ask, well, what is Sabbath? Now, the Christians, who were originally Jewish believers, chose to make a distinction between their celebration and our celebration by celebrating the Sabbath on the resurrection day, the first day of the week. But the concept is identical. But even so, both of those approaches, I think, are very limited. Because if you take into account the fact that Sabbath is bigger than just a one-day religious ordinance, and that God had many Sabbaths all the time, and it was given to us for our benefit from God, then Sabbath should actually be a prism through which we view all of our activity. It should be a prism through which we look at our values, right? And our priorities, just like God stopped, looked, judged. We should do the same thing. It should be a prism through which we think about how we spend all of our time, not just one day a week. We live in a culture where we live under the tyranny of now, largely because of technology, okay? That breaks Sabbath every day. So a broader understanding of Sabbath as looking at time, place, relationships, our whole walk with God, I think is a much, much healthier way of thinking Sabbath than should it be a Saturday or should it be a Sunday? The answer is it should be every day. Sabbath should be a way of life. Great question. I wish I'd have brought a copy of the book. I'd have given you one. Yes, Will. Sure. Okay, so now we've got the situation where we're going to agree that God exists. So the question then becomes, as I said, are there any constructs of God that we can reasonably conclude are true? In other words, they resonate with our experience and observation. Okay, well, let's start with the most basic construct of God. It goes back to that cosmological argument. Things exist, and they don't have to. Things are in motion, and they don't have to be in motion. Things exist, and nothing other than God, if God exists, is non-contingent on something else. So that doesn't even get us to theism, that just gets us to deism. But at least most thinking people, and in fact, I think I can honestly say every agnostic I've ever met is actually a deist. They're like, okay, I will concede. In fact, Christopher Hitchens, who I also had dinner with before he passed away, obviously, he once in a public forum that I was in
I wasn't one of the speakers, I was just attending, said all concede deism. All concede that there is a first cause, a prime mover. So if that's true, if you can say, well, wait a minute, okay, we're making progress here. There is a deity, good. The next most logical question is, what is the deity like? Right? It would be malpractice intellectually to not ask that question. What is the deity like? And this is where most people, I think, go wrong. Because most people start going, oh, what's the deity like? Let's look at nature. Let's look at the stars. No. Look right in here. Look right in here. Rene Descartes gave us the most wonderful clue to this. When Rene Descartes said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, he was saying something about the most basic element of our existence. And that is, technically, you could all be figments of my imagination. Technically, nothing and no one is real except me. But I can't deny my own existence. Why? Because I have cognition, and I know I exist. Now that's kind of interesting. Because in everything we observe in nature, like produces like. So if we are derived from this deity, if nothing else, if no other attribute, this deity must possess mind. Must possess mind. Now, our common experience tells us, actually, you aren't all phantoms, and I'm not a phantom of yours. I'm physical. I possess a mortal body. That is absolutely true. So, my carnality is also fundamental to my very being at its most basic level. My mind and my body. Well, if you think about all the different constructs of God that are out there, which is the one that best harmonizes our minds and the mind of God and our carnality? Well, if I only had the first 3 chapters of the Gospel of John, that would answer the question for me. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the mind. And the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And nothing that is except for that God. Everything emanates from that God. And that mind, that Logos, that being who is the basis of our being, became like me, flesh incarnate, and dwelt among us. And by the way, so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son so that I would live forever. You want to go for some other religion? There's a lot of them out there. I don't know any that resonate with the human experience of being human like the gospel does. So that's how I square that circle, Will. Thank you. These are great questions. You're doing a good job here,
yep.
Red.
They're doing. All right. So Matt, can I ask a couple of questions real quick, and then we'll get to yours. All right, because we have quite a handful of questions here, and so I want to begin with one that goes directly to something you made, a statement you made. And the question was, couldn't altruism show evolutionary benefit through improving or saving others' lives to support or increase likelihood of reproducing?
No, because the difference between altruism and any other form of goodness is the cognition about that goodness. In other words, if I am doing something, if I take one for the team, I know I'm taking one for the team, right? And so the motive for doing that, and this is really important, the motive for doing that is the team. However, if there is no discernible benefit to anyone other than the person for whom I am making an ultimate sacrifice, that is something that has no evolutionary value, in my opinion, at all, because there is no discernible group benefit to that. I am doing it knowing, in fact, that there is no benefit to anyone or anything else other than the object of my love. And by the way, that's what the cross is all about. Right? When Jesus went to the cross, Jesus went to the cross not for evolution's sake, but for the benefit of those for whom he died. So when we do, in rare circumstances, by the way, do something that is genuinely altruistic, we are imitating Christ. But it's a great question.
All right.
And people can disagree with it, by the way.
Right. All right. So here's a written in all caps. So this is a good question.
Okay.
Why did God kill? And then in parentheses, acting against the Decalogue. So
Okay.
I'm assuming we're talking about Jesus here, but I assume we could also apply that far further.
Okay, so remember I said that the way God administers his justice is through covenant. This is such a fundamental concept, I can't overstate it. So here's what a covenant is. A covenant is a treaty between a vassal king and a suzerain king. And the agreement between the kings is, I, the vassal, will pledge my fealty to you and you alone, and you, the suzerain, will guarantee my safety. But here's the deal. If either party breaks that covenant, the sanction is ultimate. The ultimate sanction. Capital punishment, however you want to term it. That's the penalty for breaking the covenant. So, in the garden, when Satan is tempting the woman in the garden, and she says, rightfully, we can eat of the fruit of any tree in the garden except that one, for if we do, we will surely die. What does Satan say? You will not die. You will not die. He's undermining the covenant. Now, there are several levels of covenant that the Bible speaks of. And they're not listed in order. You have to do your theology to get to them. But the first one is called the covenant of redemption. And the covenant of redemption is a covenant that pre-existed creation itself and existed only within the Godhead. When God created human beings, knowing that he was going to create us with free will, with agency, with the ability to either accept or reject him, he already decided by his grace that he would offer oblation, redemption. What no one knew is he was going to come down and do it himself in the person of Jesus Christ. But that was established before creation. The first covenant that we experienced as humans, the covenant of works, was that very covenant in the garden. It's very simple. If you just follow this one simple rule, you're good. Now, what happened? Did humanity keep the covenant? No. Which means by right, by God's justice, God had the right to end the human experiment right there. And that would have been perfectly just. But because of his grace, because of the covenant of redemption, he withheld that sanction. But what was withdrawn is that total protection that we would have enjoyed if we hadn't broken covenant. So we live in an already but not yet state. The already is we know that redemption has already been secured and there is a not yet existence waiting for us where there is no death, there is no sickness, there is no war, there is no killing. The lion lays down with the lamb. That's the next garden. But because it's not yet, we live in this tension. And there are times when God has to exercise his righteousness, and most of the time he exercises his grace, but we have no right to question God's character because by right, he could have ended the experiment. So we live under what is now known as the covenant of grace. And the fact that every one of us is here is proof of God's grace. And I am confident that all will be revealed at the end when we sit in that new garden, in that new eternity, in that promised reality. And it will all make sense. But do we understand all of it now? No. Because if we did, we'd be God. I don't know about you. I'm having a hard enough time being a human. I'd make a really bad God.
Okay, so you you hit on some words that are thrown out here quite quickly on free will. You just mentioned free will, and we have 3 questions right here on free will, and then that also sort of led into the question of justice, ending in the experiment, which also brings up a question of hell, which we have here. So we have some, fun questions.
How much time do we got?
Yeah, exactly. So here's what I'm going to do my best. These 3 questions. Take them with how you can, but I can't figure out a way to put it together in a synergistic way. But here's what they were. The question was, how do you reconcile morality with free will? And if God gives us free will, how can we get punished for using our free will? And then that will lead into the question of hell. So we'll just sort of leave it there.
So, look, if we didn't have free will, we'd all be automatons. And I think most of us enjoy the fact that we were created by God in God's image. And part of being created in the image of God is the ability to make moral choices. And so we make those moral choices. And we usually don't do a good job. But the fact of the matter is, that's the double-edged sword of the gift of agency that God gives us. I'll give you an example. I've heard people say, so-and-so has been anointed by God to do something. And I'm like, maybe. But is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. Because being anointed by God doesn't take away your agency. The very first king of Israel and the next 43 were all anointed by God to be kings of Israel and Judah. But only 8 of them were good. The rest were bad. Why? Because being anointed by God doesn't take away your agency any more than being created by God takes away your agency. He gives us the opportunity to exercise that agency. And the key is to align our wills with his. That's the journey we're on, is to align our will with his. I pray every single day for our government that our laws and our ways would be aligned with God's will. And that's the same thing for all of us. That our daily lives would be aligned with God's will. And we're not going to get it right all the time. In fact, those of us who are grayer in the beard, and some young folks here and some of us a little older, we look back and we can see places where, wow, did we miss God on that? But yet, by God's grace, here we are. That's also how we learn. Now, question of hell. So, my understanding of the question of hell is directly related to my understanding of the definition of evil. Because sometimes people will say, well, wait a minute. If God is morally perfect, if God is omnibenevolent, how could evil exist? And here's my answer. Evil doesn't actually exist. Evil is not a thing. Evil is not a substantive thing. Evil is simply the term that we use for the absence of goodness. Now, this is a big theological issue here, and I'm happy to say Augustine is on my side here. Because it was Augustine who said that evil is not the opposite of goodness, it's the absence of goodness, the privation of goodness. But that also means that there's no such thing as a middle ground. That which is of God is good. Anything that is not of God is by definition then evil. So unlike popular thinking, we can just sort of go through life in the middle ground. I'm not good, I'm not bad, I'm just doing my thing. Sorry. Either it's good or it's evil. You make the choice. Bob Dylan nailed it with that song, You Gotta Serve Somebody, right? Maybe the devil, maybe the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. That is theologically accurate. And I would say similarly, obviously when we have, ancient descriptions of hell, they're pretty scary, and they refer to hell as a physical place, and if that's how you think of it, that's fine. I actually think of hell as total separation from God. In a sense, non-being. Because in the eschaton, those who are saved will actually be with God. We will be in total communion with God. Those who aren't actually got what they asked for. They actually made a choice. They exercised their agency, not to believe in or follow. And so they won't be part of that party. I find that to be a much better way of thinking of it than a place where there's gnashing of teeth, etc. But again, we could argue this from here till eternity, and we would have differences of opinion. The critical factor is that ultimately it's God's agency. It's God's decision. We've got to trust God with our eternal salvation. There isn't a preacher in the world who's ever saved a soul. Remember that. It's the Holy Spirit who saves souls. So, in a sense, when we have that conversation, we're kind of in an area that we shouldn't be even in. Question, yes.
Yeah, actually, you're talking about altruism,
Mm-hmm.
which is totally even beyond good.
It's other-centered.
Right.
Yes.
And I would think that there is malevolence, which is not just, not being good. I mean, it's the total opposite. And how do you explain the presence of malevolence? That seems to be not just the absence.
Because malevolence is the natural conclusion. Malevolence is where you go when you reject benevolence. It will devolve into malevolence. So I'm not saying that evil acts or the things we call evil aren't real or don't exist. They do. But what I'm saying is it's the result of, okay? It's the result of a lack of love, a lack of care, a lack of benevolence, a lack of godliness, a lack of justice, a lack of righteousness. If you take that to its logical conclusion, you will get malevolent acts. You will get things that are evil. Do you understand the difference?
I do, but I also understand the difference between, not being, there are people that are good, but they don't believe in Christ, but they're not malevolent either. There is a in between somewhere.
Okay, so let me give you my opinion of that. There are people who are certainly capable of doing good things, because every human being, no matter how base they are, never sheds the imago Dei, never sheds the image of God. But ultimately, these questions are questions of eternity, questions of the eschaton, right? Questions of eternal judgment. They're way above my pay grade, okay? And I believe sincerely that it's a delusion to think that we can be somehow just below benevolent. And by the way, we all fail at this. But if we believe in and trust God, then we will do everything we can with our agency to be what God calls us to be. And no matter how badly we fail, God has paid the price for our failure. But God doesn't give us the option to abstain from a decision. God insists ultimately that we have a decision to make. And even though those people may not manifest malevolent, evil things, I agree with that, because they're still creatures created in the image of God. If you take that to its logical conclusion, that's where it leads. And we see that, by the way. We see that in the devolution of civility in post-Christian cultures. We see it all the time. Now, again, that doesn't mean there aren't some really lovely places in this world where some really nice people do really lovely things. I've traveled literally all over the world, and I've seen wonderful expressions of love and goodness. It's because that they're human beings created in the image of God. But when we talk about the issue, the big issue of heaven and hell, we only have one option as Christians. Either we do accept Christ and the cross or we don't. And that's a hard thing for a lot of people to accept. But what's the alternative? The alternative would be what? Universalism, right? That would be the alternative. If that's true, what was the purpose of the cross? If everybody's in, what was the purpose of the cross? So that, and by the way, we're way off the topic now. But those are great questions to ask. And if I were to stand here and tell you that I'm absolutely certain I've got it right, I should be fired from my job. Seriously, I should be fired from my job. So I used to tell my kids when they grew up, they went to a new city, right, which they do, they move, searching for a church. I would say, if you walk into a church and they tell you they've got all the answers to all the questions, get out of that church as fast as you can. Because that means they haven't even asked all the questions. Great question.
Great. So judging by some of those questions too, I'm hoping that we'll actually get a second Think Night in the next couple months, probably addressing more of those. Want to finish off with just one last question from Matt, and then we will call it an evening.
So the argument you gave for morality rests upon the observation that there is objective morality, that people have objective opinions on what objective morality is. Yet that seems to imply that those observations and those instances of objective morality are indeed meaningful libertarian views. So is the lack of free will or determinism a conceivable threat to this argument, or are there ways to combat that?
No, I don't think they're truly exclusive, because, as I said, we are not automatons. I'm a Calvinist, okay? So, as I said, I believe in election because ultimately that agency belongs to God. That has nothing to do with our individual agency when it comes to being moral actors. Our agency as moral actors is completely unrelated to the determinism of our salvation. But it's a great question.
Well, great. Well, can we give a round of applause to Dr. Barnes?
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
I was just sitting there feeling like, I am so glad that is not me right now. And then I was like, but Sunday's coming. And so that's why we have Will preaching tomorrow. So you want to be here to ask all your questions to Will, who studies directly under Dr. Barnes, and he would be happy to answer all those questions for you as we work through them. But no, actually, it's a great point that Dr. Barnes made at the very end there, which is we do not espouse to be a church that says we got it all together. That's why we're having nights like tonight, because we're wrestling through questions together. And so just regardless of where you are in the faith journey, we really want to be a part of that and work through questions together. That's central to who we are is we believe that we are trying to create and be under this umbrella, what is called the family of God. And in families, we ask and wrestle through lots of big questions. And so I want to encourage you with that. Before I finish, one last thing. There was a raffle for winning a $50 Amazon gift card for those who signed up. And before this evening, we wound up drawing the name. And the name that was drawn was indeed Wilson, who is actually our drummer. Let's go. I'll see you, big one. So yeah, So I just want to remind you, tomorrow, 10:45 a.m. Is a regular service time. We'd love to have you if you're able to make it. And I just pray that you have a great week. Again, say thank you to Dr. Barnes as you leave. And we have a question right here. Oh. Great, great. Well, brothers and sisters, again, make sure you say thank you to Dr. Barnes on your way out this evening. We pray you have a great night, and thank you so much for coming. Hope to see you tomorrow.